Jane and Jamie are researchers with Flare Wildlife Research who are part of Melbourne University. I don't understand the full relationship there. We're really excited to have them joining us. Obviously, following the events of the summer that we've all experienced, I think that all of us are curious about the ways that we can, when we're revegetating our properties or working with others to revegetate, or even just designing our own garden areas, ways that we can try and make sure that they're more fire resilient. I think we all accept, and I think Jane will be reassured to hear me say this, that it is impossible to make any home 100% fireproof. We need to put that at the front of this conversation today. But there are possibly things, we're hoping to learn things today, I guess. And I would invite everyone just to come with an open mind, listen to what Jane and Jamie are learning. I understand that they're in the process of undertaking this research, so there's no silver bullet that we're going to learn about today. We're all learning about what's happening with our environment at this time in Australia. I think we're already learning before climate change started. So there's a lot going on. And I think that this is just going to be one of many learning experiences we're all going to have about, hopefully we got to put together a puzzle and work out better ways of designing our revegetation patches and our gardens. So I'll now stop babbling and hand over to Jane and Jamie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thanks, Tanya, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting us along and for everyone coming along. And today we'll just be sharing, we're doing some research on plant flammability, but also we'll just be sharing insights from other people's research as well in Australia, because there's other groups also studying this. So as Tanya mentioned, Jamie and I we work at the University of Melbourne. We're in a research team called Flare Wildfire Research. So it's a team of about 30 researchers, all looking at different aspects of fire behaviour and fire regimes in Australia. And the focus for Jamie and I is on landscape flammability, doing a number of projects from the leaf scale all the way up to whole landscapes and trying to understand what characteristics of vegetation drive fires. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming from tonight, which is the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. So in the presentation today, we'll give you a bit of an introduction to vegetation flammability, and in particular, how it relates to house loss. Jamie will talk to you about some of the key drivers of vegetation flammability, and then we'll have a little bit of a look at managing garden flammability, this concept of defensible space, and then finally how you could assess flammability of your own garden. So this presentation came about because a few months ago I was asked by the ABC to comment on an interesting case that occurred during some of those fires in Western Victoria, the Nat Tamuk fire. On the 9th of January, a very intense fire. But despite those extreme conditions, this house here didn't burn down. And the owners thought it could have something to do with the succulent garden that they had there in front of the house that you can see in the photo there. So my comment to the journalist was that the succulents probably did contribute to saving that house. Succulents, we know, are a very low flammability vegetation type due to the high levels of moisture that they hold. But did the succulents save the house? Well, let's come back to that later in this presentation. But first, let's have a think about Swiss cheese. And this is a model that emerged during COVID, and we can apply it now to house loss. So basically during COVID, they use this sort of Swiss cheese analogy to talk about how you need to have many different layers of defense to protect yourself from catching or being badly impacted by COVID-19. Any single layer of defense will have holes in it. So you need multiple layers. And we can think about that as well for trying to protect our houses from bushfires. We need to be looking at a number of different interventions at a number of different scales. So here we've got interventions at the landscape scale, or things that will impact whether or not your house, the likelihood that your house will burn down. And some of these are completely out of our control. For example, the location of the home, if it's located on a very steep slope, if it's located next to dense vegetation. the type of vegetation surrounding the house, more broadly in the landscape, this is not just on your property, whether it's forest, whether it's stringy bark forest, or whether it's grassland, the density of the houses. So we're finding that there's quite a lot of houses burned down due to house transmission. So houses that are quite closely packed together have a higher chance of burning down. And then we move to a smaller scale, the interface scale, we call it. And then there's things like fuel management, which might be done by fire agencies. This could be planned burning. This could be mulching. It could be some sort of thinning. These things will influence the likelihood that your house will burn down. There's fuel breaks as well, which aren't designed to stop the fire, but they help with access for firefighters to put in suppression and also put in backburns. And then there's fire suppression itself, which will influence the likelihood of the house burning down. Then we move to the property scale, which is where we're hoping to be able to make some impacts and where everyone's interested tonight. And this is where we can look at things like defensible space that I'll talk about in a little more detail later. Vegetation management, so the species that you're planting within your garden and also how you arrange those species. Other factors that are important here is access. So how easy is it for fire trucks to get into your property and the amount of water that you have available. And then there's factors relating to the building itself. So what is it built from and how easy are those materials to ignite? And how well protected is your home from embers getting inside the home. So all these different layers build up and no single layer is going to stop your house from burning down. So we want to have as many of these in place as possible. And the other thing I'll just mention at the start of this presentation is that even if you had all these barriers in place, some houses will still unfortunately burn down. And we need to realize this. And this graph here illustrates the percentage of houses that have burnt down under different fire danger rating conditions. And what you see here is the graph really spiking up once we get to the extreme and catastrophic fire danger conditions. So as the fire weather and the intensity of the fire itself increases, a number of those barriers that we might have in place are just overridden by those conditions. Another thing that would be it's useful to think about when we're designing our garden is what actually causes houses to burn down in a bushfire. So we often think about perhaps it being the flames themselves, but actually the biggest cause of house loss in Australia is from firebrands or embers. So these are little fragments of bark, or they could be leaves or twigs coming off the trees, sometimes kilometres away from the house itself. And they can lodge themselves in gutters full of leaves or pile up on decks and cause the house to burn down. So that's actually the biggest cause of house loss in Australia. On top of that, we've got, of course, the flames themselves that can cause an ignition, and also radiation from radiant heat from the surrounding fire, from the burning vegetation, but also from houses nearby. So in designing a low flammability garden, we need to be thinking about reducing the embers, the radiation, and the flames. So what is flammability? Quite broadly, it's just a way of thinking about, or a measure of the ability of vegetation to burn. And if you look in the scientific literature, there's 3 different ways they measure flammability. So the first one is ignitability, so how easily a plant will ignite. The second is combustibility, so how intensely does it burn? And the third is sustainability, which is how long the plant burns for, or the vegetation burns for, the biomass. So ignitability is important because it'll influence the probability that a fire will occur in your garden, or that plants will ignite and then potentially transmit to your house. Combustibility is important because this is influencing the radiant heat exposure to your house. So something that's more combustible will transmit more radiant heat to your home. And then sustainability is really important because fuels that burn for longer are more likely to ignite adjacent fuels. And here we're talking particularly about things like mulch or timber sleepers, so those heavier fuels that tend to smolder and burn for longer and then can cause reignitions down the track. Right. Now I'm going to hand over to Jamie, who's going to talk to you a little about what drives vegetation flammability. Could be a moment we could pause if there's any questions that have come up, or we can just continue.
I think we're good.
All right, go on, Jamie.
Thanks. Yeah, hi everyone, my name's Jamie. So I'm just going to run through what drives vegetation flammability. But first I want us to think about what kind of we have available to us at the moment. So if you'd hit the notes, thanks, Jane. So currently there's a lot of guidance and advice out there about what species to plant, so low flammability species. And these are a good starting point, but there are some limitations with these species lists. So one of the first limitations is that not all species are low flammable, and they're not going to be low flammable under the same conditions. So as we alluded to earlier, plants will burn differently under different conditions. So you could have a plant burning differently under drought conditions versus under well-watered conditions. Some other limitations are related to how these species lists are derived. So most are based really on limited evidence. So there's no consistent approach for how flammability is measured. So there's many different devices out there measuring flammability in different ways. Also, they're mostly based on leaf scale flammability assessments, which, as I'll allude to later on, is only one scale of flammability, and the scales don't really necessarily translate across. And most of those leaf scale flammability tests are focused only on one component of flammability, which is ignitability, which Jane mentioned as the ability to ignite. So there's a few different things there that make these low flammability species lists a good starting point, but it's not telling you everything you need to know about flammability. And really what the most important thing is not necessarily the plant species themselves, but how those plants are arranged. And that's going to have a greater impact on how fire will spread than the flammability of those individual species. So with that context in mind, I'm just going to run through some different key examples from the literature and research that we've done about the different drivers of flammability. So we're going to start by looking at the leaf traits. So that's the individual leaves themselves, the plant characteristics, so the characteristics of an individual plant, and then how those plants are arranged. And I've got the arrows there because these factors, you can't consider them separately, but rather that they build on each other. So you can have particular leaf traits, which then are on a particular plant, and then how those particular plants are arranged will then determine how flammable a vegetation is or how flammable the garden is. So if we start off with leaf traits, one that is obvious to many will be moisture. So that's how much moisture is held within the leaf. And obviously, if you have less moisture, the plant is going to be able to ignite faster because there's less water required to burn off. But there's other leaf traits out there that are also important. So one of the big ones is the size and the shape of the leaves. So large, thin leaves have increased flammability, and that's because they're able to ignite quicker and also spread the flame quicker compared to a thick, small leaf. One important aspect that's not as well understood is chemical composition. So things like the oil content, how much nutrients a plant might have in their leaves, and things like lignin and cellulose will all influence flammability, but they do it in different ways. So many of you might be familiar with the oil content in eucalypt leaves or tea tree leaves. So that can increase flammability because those oils convert to flammable gases, and that helps the burning process. Things like lignin and cellulose can increase flaming duration, so how long a single leaf might burn for, because they're really energy-rich components. But then if you have a leaf high in cellulose, that might decrease ignitability. Sorry, not cellulose, phosphorus, because phosphorus can act as a retardant, so blocking those processes from happening and making it less ignitable. We can then move up to think about the traits. So the traits basically refer to characteristics of a plant or a plant species. And we're looking here at the whole plant, not just one leaf. So one that's really big is the amount of fuel, which is how much biomass there is, or we also call it fuel load. But you can also measure it by branch surface area, so how much surface area there is of branch and leaf material. And these are two things that we found were really big drivers of plant flammability in the lab. So I've got a picture of the apparatus there on the screen. So that's called the variable heat flux apparatus. And we have this in our lab in Creswick. And with this machine, we tested the flammability of about 15 plant species at the branch scale. And we found that if you have species with higher branch total surface area, so more leaves and branches, you get a shorter time to ignition. So that plant takes less time to ignite. But if you have a plant with more biomass, you have a longer flaming duration, which makes sense because there's more material there available to burn. Some other important plant traits at this scale is the amount of dead material that is on the plant. And this can be a factor about the plant itself, but it can also be related to drought conditions. So if you have more dead material on a plant, that's going to ignite quicker and then burn faster. The next one there is plant architecture. So that's how leaves are arranged on a plant. And it also relates to the size and the density and the number of branches on a plant. So I've got an example there of two species, so sweet Bursera and prickly Moses. So sweet Bursera, you can see, has sort of medium-sized leaves that are quite sparsely arranged, whereas the prickly Moses has small leaves, but they're quite densely packed. So those two species are going to behave quite differently. One example is for the sweet Bursera, if you imagine lots of embers flying in, it's not going to really catch well on that plant, whereas for the prickly Moses, because it's so dense and continuous, those embers are going to land quite well on there. And the prickly Moses might also be able to hold dead material from fallen leaves and things, which could mean that plant is quicker to ignite. The next one relates to plant arrangement. So this is looking at the arrangement of multiple plants in a garden or in vegetation. One of the things that's going to be important there, if you have enough plants, is litter bed. So that's the cover and the packing. And when we're talking about packing, we're talking about how the leaves are arranged in the litter bed. So that's how close they are together and how much oxygen, which influences how much oxygen is available for combustion. So I've got two examples there. One is the tea tree and the other is eucalypt. So tea tree has really small, thin leaves, and you can see it packs really densely. Whereas with the eucalypt, it's got really large, thick leaves, and it packs less densely. And this means more air is available for combustion, and the fire can spread more easily and ignite quicker. The other thing that's important is how connected the vegetation is. So we're thinking about connectivity in terms of the horizontal connectivity, but also the vertical connectivity. And that's going to influence how quickly fire can spread both horizontally and vertically. So if you have really high horizontal and vertical connectivity, and that's close to houses, that's going to influence and make house loss increase the risk of house loss compared to vegetation that's more sparsely distributed and not as well connected. Another thing to consider in terms of plant arrangement is the tree layer itself, and it can have a mixed effect on flammability. So if you have native tree species or tree species that can act as a high source of firebrands or embers, such as these stringy barks or ribbon barks, that's potentially going to increase the flammability. And also the trees themselves can act as fuel in a crown fire. But depending on the species and how they're arranged, it could reduce flammability because trees can reduce the wind coming in. They can also provide shade, and they also might be able to filter the firebrands. So depending on the species and the arrangement, it may increase or decrease the flammability. One concept or idea, I guess, that's becoming increasingly popular and used in the landscape is this concept of green fire breaks. So this is the strategic placed plantings of low flammability vegetation. And it's not, in some instances, it's not just about the flammability of that vegetation, but it's also done to promote biodiversity and also for carbon storage reasons. So one of our colleagues, Erica Marshall, looked at the effectiveness of green fire breaks using fire simulations. And this figure on the right here is from her research. So it's showing the different potential fire behaviours of different scenarios next to a house. So the first one, you've got a cleared landscape or grassland, and basically you've got high continuity of grass fuel, and that's leading to high wind speed, which means your exposure to the house is really high, and there's a high rate of spread and high likelihood of radiant heat hitting that house. You've also got little or no carbon storage capacity, and it's also providing little habitat. The next one there is fire behaviour within a continuous forest. So you can imagine that a house is just situated right next to an area of state forest or other forested land. Excuse me, just my dog's scratching at the door. I'll just let them in. So yeah, with that one, with the continuous forest, you can see it's quite a dense, highly connected fuel, and that's really helping fire spread. It might have high habitat and carbon storage opportunity, but you're also having a really high fire risk and high risk of house loss. And then the one at the bottom there is the green fire break. So with the green fire break concept, it's really about the things I talked about before. So disrupting that fuel, having bare patches, having low vertical and horizontal connectivity, but also potentially planting species that can act as habitat and also provide carbon storage. And then you also need to think about the distance between those plantings and the houses. And having distances can mean that the likelihood of house loss via ember attack and radiant heat is lowered. And some other researchers have sort of come up with this way of selecting, or this guide to selecting what species to plant, and that's shown there on the left. So they really think that to start out, you should be using species that are commercially available, are biodiversity promoting, have low flammability, are weatherproof. So this means that they're going to survive future climate conditions in that spot. They're health safe, and then also consideration of other community values. And that leaves you with your selection pool of species that you might want to plant. So some key takeaways from what I just presented. It's not just about a single plant species, but really it's about the traits, the characteristics, and the arrangement of those plant species. Of course, no plant is fireproof, and good garden design can reduce, but not eliminate the risk. And it's really important that along with good garden design, that it's maintained. So with that in mind, what is a low flammability species and what are the traits associated with that? So if you're thinking about a litter bed, if it's present, you really want to have a litter bed that's made up of small leaves because that's densely packed and it's really harder to ignite. The flip side with that is you also have to consider what species is producing that litter. So here we've used the example of tea tree. But if you have a dense thicket of tea tree, that's going to present quite a flammable as live vegetation as a shrub. So really it's about balancing those two things, which can make it tricky and complex. For the ground or the shrub layer, you really want species that have an open or a sparse branching structure. So it's hard for flames to spread from leaf to leaf, but it's also hard for them to be catching embers if embers are coming. You want leaves that have high moisture or are really thick and fleshy, like the pig face shown in the picture. You also want species that don't really retain their foliage, particularly their dead foliage, and avoiding plants with high oil content. Finally, for the tree layer, as I said before about bark, it can present a really high risk. So you really want species with less flammable bark, such as smooth bark species. And having all these traits can really help to reduce the risk, but of course, you're not eliminating it completely.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So Jamie's talked a bit about the arrangement of plants in the garden and how that can be more important than the actual species that you're planting. Defensible space is one way of thinking about this, and I thought it might be helpful to just touch on this briefly now and what this concept actually means. So here's a diagram that's in a paper published by some researchers in the University of Tasmania, where they're trying to sort of illustrate this idea of defensible space. So on one side of the house, they've got a well-designed garden with this defensible space concept built in, and then on the other side, they've got what they call ineffective defensible space. And what they're showing here is really trying to build a bit of a buffer zone in your garden around your house, and with different layers in that buffer zone. So in the first 1.5 meters, building in a fuel-free zone. So that's basically a vegetation-free and also other types of fuel, which I'll touch on in the next slide. So avoiding really any fuel at all in that zone, except perhaps succulents. And then out to 10 meters, we can start to have some vegetation, but it needs to be quite managed in terms of its spatial arrangement. Then they call the next zone out up to 30 meters the tree zone. So we've got trees in here because they can capture embers and they can reduce wind speeds, and we do want to have them still in our landscapes, obviously for habitat reasons as well. But it's still quite a heavily managed zone here. And then beyond that, we can start to have the sort of the native forest type structures. Whereas on the other side here, we're not managing the vegetation at all leading up to the house. So we've got a higher likelihood of that house burning down. So what do they suggest we're doing within this defensible space zone? Well, here, mostly when I'm talking about fuel, I'm talking about vegetation, but there's other fuel types as well. So they're talking about managing the amount of fuel, the type of fuel, and its arrangement. So touching on the same sorts of things that Jamie's already mentioned here. So in terms of the amount of fuel, first of all, no fuel within that 1.5 meters of the house. So instead you could have gravel, you could have paving, you could have like a pebble area or something like that, but no mulch or garden beds with shrubs, particularly under windows. Then beyond that, keeping the lawn or the grass short, and they recommend 5 centimeters long within the 10 meters around the house, and then it can be a bit longer than that beyond the 10 meter. Thinning out foliage in the trees and shrubs so that you're having sort of sparser vegetation close to the house, so you've got less chance of flames being able to transmit from one branch to the other. And of course, removing any dead material that's building up within those shrubs and also on the ground where you've got litter accumulating and that sort of thing. In terms of fuel type, they talk about choosing plants with low flammability traits, which, as we've discussed, can be a little more tricky to do than you might expect. There is species lists that could be used out there with caution, or just focusing on the traits themselves and working through something like the CFA guide that they have, that you can sort of step through and think about the different traits and the likely flammability of that species. But also there's other things to think about, like using non-flammable fencing materials. So for example, metal fences rather than timber fencing, avoiding the use of mulch close to the house, and if possible, keeping the plants and lawn well watered. But obviously this can be really challenging in drought conditions. And finally, removing other fuel types, because sometimes it can be just something you wouldn't even consider, like a doormat, that can be sort of the weakest link that leads to your house burning down. And I've heard of that happening before, or timber outdoor furniture, piles of wood, or gas bottles, or even rubbish bins I've heard as well if they're right up against the house. And then we need to think here about the horizontal distribution of the vegetation, so that it's more difficult for fire to spread from plant to plant. So this could mean clustering your plantings with separating sort of islands of vegetation with perhaps some short grass or non-flammable material like gravel in between. And also thinking about the vertical distribution. So we want to try and prevent the flames on the ground from spreading up into the canopies of the trees. So removing lower branches of trees, or not planting shrubs and other vegetation directly under trees, particularly when those trees have bark like the stringy bark that we saw earlier that's really good at carrying the fire up into the canopy. Now, we thought we'd spend the last few minutes just talking about how you might go about assessing the flammability of your garden. And this is quite tricky, and there's very standard approaches for native forest and less developed approaches for gardens. So it's really an area that we need to do more research in. Some of you may have heard of the overall fuel hazard guide. This is used more for native forests across the whole of southern Australia, but it's a way of assessing fuel hazard. Basically, they divide up the vegetation into these different layers or stratas, and then do a visual assessment for each layer. So surface fuel is the litter on the forest floor. Near surface fuel is your grass layer and your really low shrubs that are in contact with the ground. Elevated fuel is your shrub layer, and then they also think about the bark as well. And really, we're thinking about the different types of sort of fire or how each of these layers contribute to fire behaviour. So surface fuel is where the fire typically ignites. The elevated fuel will lead to larger flames. That's your shrub layer can lead to larger flames and also act as a ladder into the tree canopy, which is why I was talking about the need to sort of prune or not plant shrubs right directly underneath trees. And the bark is the predominant source of those embers and creating the spot fires ahead of the main fire front. And there's particular bark types that are most hazardous that this guide talks about here. And so to assess these different layers, it's quite a simple assessment where we're looking at different things depending on which layer. So for the bark, we're looking at just the type of bark and also considering the amount of bark, but that's in particular the amount of char, because if it's been burnt recently, then it tends to have less bark available to produce spot fires. And then for these shrub layers, we're looking at the cover, so that and also the percentage that's dead. For the surface layer, we're looking at the cover and the litter depth. And so we'd make these assessments for each of these layers, and the guide steps through how to do that. And then we plug the values into these sorts of tables. So this one here is for the shrub layer or the elevated layer. And you can see here there's plant cover and the percent dead. And we can look up a particular plant cover. It might be 20 to 30%. And then if there's less than 20% dead, then that gives us a moderate hazard. Once we've assessed each of the different layers, so the bark, the elevated, and the surface, near surface, we can get an overall hazard level for the vegetation. And here's a couple of examples in a forest setting of what an extreme versus a low hazard might look like. So you can see down here, this is actually in a fuel break. You can see that the vegetation in the understory has been heavily managed there, so that brings it back down to a low hazard. So this guide could be useful to gauge the fire hazard in a garden, but it's actually designed to assess fuel hazard from a fire suppression perspective in native forests. So not from a house loss point of view. So it's not entirely relevant for our needs, but it's certainly the most widely used guide for assessing fuel that we currently have available. But another one that I thought I'd mention to you is a recent study published last year that's tried to develop a fuel or fire hazard guide that's specific to gardens. And I'm quite keen for us to have a go at testing this, but we haven't been able to yet. So basically they think about 3 classes of hazard. So the vegetation itself, this is your shrub layer, and estimating similar to the fuel hazard guide I talked about before, the cover for trees and shrubs, the percentage of flammable species, and they use the CFA guide to assess whether or not the species are flammable, and then the spatial arrangement as well. So they've got a range of different metrics for estimating that. They also look at the ground layer, so the lawn, the litter, the presence or absence of mulch, and then also note the presence of other potentially flammable objects close to the house. So this is in the defendable space zone, so gas bottles, firewood, flammable fences, that sort of thing. Interestingly, you add up all of that for each of your different zones of defensible space, but then you could, and that will give you a hazard score, but then that score can be reduced by the presence of certain things in your garden. So the first one is succulents there, which is really interesting. If you've got succulents within that defensible space zone, you can reduce your hazard of your garden. Non-flammable surfaces that we've talked about a bit already. Non-flammable tree species in the tree zone, which is a bit like what Jamie was talking about with the green fire breaks, which some species can trap or have been thought to be able to trap embers and reduce those spot fires and those embers reaching the house. And then also the presence of metal fences, which can act as a shield for radiant heat. And so we look at all these factors, and that gives us a garden-based fire hazard score, which is an interesting concept. And so coming back to the example from the very start of the presentation, I thought I would just try and loosely apply this garden-based hazard to this case study here to understand whether or not this house was saved by the succulent garden. And so first of all, let's have a look at the level of hazard overall in the garden, just based on these photos here. So in terms of the vegetation, I would say the tree and shrub cover is quite low. The percentage of flammable species is moderate because perhaps some of these species, we can't really tell what they are from the photo, but it looks like there's eucalypts and other potentially flammable species in the background there. But the spatial arrangement of the vegetation in their garden is quite sparse. And then in terms of the ground layer, their lawn is very short and I can't see any litter or mulch, so I've put none there. And there's no flammable objects present like gas bottles. They seem to have paving around their house and that sort of thing. So in terms of the hazard, I would say overall we've got a level of hazard of low. And then in terms of those hazard reducing factors, well, we've got the succulents there. They probably played a role. We've got those non-flammable surfaces, so the sort of paved or tiled area directly around the house there. We're not sure about the non-flammable trees, but they definitely have the metal fencing too around the back of the house here. So based on that, I would say this is a low fire hazard garden, and therefore perhaps the succulents did play a role in saving the house, but there's a number of other factors at play as well that would have contributed to this house not burning down. So just to finish off, Jamie showed you a little bit about our fire lab. We also do a lot of work at larger scales. What are we trying to do as the next steps in this research is basically trying to develop more robust ways of measuring plant flammability at scales relevant to garden design. So moving from that leaf and branch scale, which is less relevant, to understanding our whole plants and how groups of plants burn, and then looking at spatial arrangements of that to try and work out optimal designs for gardens and for the wider landscape. And that's where I'm going to leave it tonight, but we're really interested to hear any questions or have any follow-up discussion about this. So I'll stop sharing and yeah.
Wow.
Did any questions pop up?
A clap is coming from me. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think a lot of other people will really enjoy that too. It's all about learning, isn't it? We're all learning together here, but you're learning more than we are on average. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. It's fascinating. We appreciate the way it's weighed with we just don't know, and that's fair enough. But you're starting to answer some of the questions, which is really exciting. So thank you for that. And yeah, we really are very appreciative of you joining us this evening. And it's been a few months in the making. So thank you for staying in there with us and joining us. And yeah, applause from me. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure, and thanks everyone for coming.